We've been talking all morning long about the crisis of affordability in this city. We've heard from some of the many people who've been priced out, people who commute in, like Billy and Jenna. We've been talking about that now because there is a mayoral race, not just here in Hamilton, but of course in the city of Toronto. And there are real questions about affordability and what those who want to lead this city in these cities can do about affordability. Denise Balkison is a columnist with the Globe and Mail. Richard Florida, professor in the School of Cities and the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, and they both join us this morning to talk about the affordability crisis we find ourselves in. Good morning to you both.
Morning, Matt.
Richard, we'll start with you. Less than a month to go until the municipal election. How seriously do you think politicians should be taking the issue of affordability?
Well, I think they should be, and I think they are. I think having both the mayor on and having Jennifer Keesmaat on this show this morning is a testimony to that. Look, we have probably one of the worst housing crises in the world. We are one of now the world's, not Canada's, 10 most unaffordable cities when you take the incomes we make compared to the housing costs we pay. So this is a really big crisis, and maybe the biggest crisis our city faces.
Statistically speaking, Richard, what does that look like? Who is being forced out of the city?
Well, it was very interesting to hear the segment earlier about the best and brightest leaving, and I think that's true to an extent. And younger people, even in our program at the Rotman School, these are the best and brightest, and certainly those who will make a high income are saying they can't afford to buy a home, they can afford to rent. But the reality is the people getting priced out are the single mom, the person who's working as a retail clerk or as a clerical assistant, a personal home service aide, the members of the so-called service class. Half of our workforce, largely women, immigrants, visible minorities, who toil in these low-wage precarious service jobs. The members of the professional and knowledge class have about $50,000 left over after they pay for housing. The members of this service class have about $11,000 left over. How can you pay for daycare? How can you pay for food? How can you pay for transport with $11,000 left over after you pay for your housing?
You wrote a piece this summer, Denise, in the Globe saying, and these are your words, Toronto has felt increasingly unlivable for years, and that things really seem to be at a crisis point. Mm-hmm. Walk us through how you see the issue of affordability for you and for your friends.
Well, so I just stopped paying daycare. My son just started junior kindergarten, and so for the past 4 years, we were paying $15,000 to $17,000 a year in daycare costs, and I would say even like my husband and I both have good jobs, professional jobs, and definitely the cost of living here factored into the choice to have one kid. As I was also saying to the producers when we were talking about this show, so 2 of the families, we had 4 kids in my son's daycare, and 2 of them, right before JK, they've just moved out of the city because they were renting, and they, as Richard said, had absolutely no savings. And when they were thinking about actually wanting a backyard and actually wanting a permanent place for their kids, they were just like, nope. And so one of them went to Guelph and one of them went to Peterborough.
Can I go back to what you just said? And again, you don't want to pry or anything like that, but you decided to have one kid in part because of the cost of raising children in the city of Toronto?
That's not really the decision. I would say the reason that my husband doesn't want to is a lack of sleep. But we have a 2-bedroom house. We have a very small backyard, and we also just got our daycare money back. And when Richard talks about having that money left over, that $11,000, we would not have any extra money. It would be no vacations and no dinners out, and that sort of thing is why you live in a city. It's how you enjoy your life, and if it was just going to become a complete crunch, it wouldn't seem worth it to me.
Matt,
I want to go back to Richard. Richard, continue. Sorry.
What we do know about having kids in expensive cities is it doesn't affect overall fertility or the overall birth rate. It has a big effect on delaying. A huge, and ultimately when you delay, that could affect the fertility rate. But I do think when you take expensive housing, the rat race we're in, that it is having an effect on fertility. And what holds up our fertility rate in big cities is immigrants and new people. So I think we have created a rat race that maybe it's not just the cost of housing, but the whole rat race does affect our ability to have as many kids as we might like.
What did you mean, Denise? This is a piece that you wrote that went all over the place because people felt what you were talking about. What did you mean when you said that the city of Toronto has felt increasingly unlivable for years?
Well, it's not just affordability, although I think transit ties into it, but it's impossible to get around, and it's made everyone very angry and grouchy getting around. Just this morning at 7 a.m., someone gave me the finger. There's no traffic yet. People are increasingly competitive. You're competitive for daycare spots. You're competitive for affordable rec center programs for your kids, because otherwise you have to pay $400 for swimming lessons. It's made people very competitive and less friendly and stressed out, and I just feel it as a vibe. You know, that column was about Toronto because I got to spend a month in Montreal this summer, and it just seemed more relaxed. People just seemed to be enjoying life more.
Richard, what's at stake if people can't afford to live in the city that they want to be in, the city that they work in, the city that they feel some affinity to?
Well, I think Denise said it. We get an angry, anxious city. And let me say this quite clearly. Having lived here now almost a dozen years, Toronto is angrier than New York. I mean, when I walk the streets of New York, people are friendlier than in Toronto. And certainly when I came here, Toronto felt much more like what Denise says Montreal feels like. So one is the anger and anxiety. We see that in the safety on our streets. We see that on violence. But the other thing is we're a horrifically divided city. We are now approaching the levels of social and economic division that make us look more like a Chicago than like a Winnipeg or an Edmonton. So we're divided. Our middle class is shrinking. And one last thing I wanted to say on this point. It's not like Hamilton is a bargain. I'm looking at the data. You know, in Toronto, you need to make $160,000 a year to afford a house. In Hamilton, you need to make $105,000. In Toronto, it takes 9 years to save up for the down payment to buy a house. In Hamilton, it takes 4.5 years. In Toronto, you might spend 73% of your income for a house. In Hamilton, you spend 50%. So our affordability problem is not just Toronto. It's affecting all the stuff around us.
Just briefly to both of you, and I'll start with Denise. Do you have the sense, we're in an election season, that those who want to lead our cities have a real sense of the affordability crisis and how to address it?
I am glad that both Mr. Tory and Ms. Keesmaat are discussing housing affordability. I don't know that they or even myself have felt it personally. I definitely want the conversation to go more out into the suburbs, more out into high rises. It needs more nuance and more thought than we have given it so far.
I think having Jennifer Keesmaat, who will be on shortly in the race, has pushed this debate. Without Jennifer in the race, I don't think we'd have a conversation. I think Jennifer has made this part of a conversation. I also think she's fairly well aware of the issue extending beyond the core into the suburbs in our conversation. So I think, one, she's raised the issue and she's pushed the mayor. I also thought she's pushed the mayor to consider these issues in a way that he might otherwise not have. Look, we have this land in the city we can use. We can use that land to make housing more affordable by selling it at a lower rate. Also, one thing we can consider, we have these employment lands. For years we thought about jobs and employment. Maybe we need to consider making them housing lands. Housing is to our time what jobs and industry was to a previous time. So I think there's things we can do, but Lord God, this has become more than urgent today.
Mm-hmm. We will continue to talk about this and get into the nuance that Denise was speaking about in just a moment's time as well. But in the meantime, it's great to have you both here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.